All right, everybody, let's get today's program started. Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to the Lunchtime Discovery Series. It's good to be with you for another edition of our program. As always, gathering here at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences YouTube channel, where we can meet interesting people who do interesting things out there in the world of science, nature, conservation, art. Well, today we're doing a little bit of all of that, I think, and more. It's always exciting because you gather here with us and we get to meet these people, hear their stories, gain their insights, but also you all get the chance to interact with our guest speakers every week as well, which honestly is one of the great parts. We do a little bit of learning, we get some stories, and then we get to have a conversation with these fascinating people. Now, the Lunchtime Discovery Series is brought to you, organized, coordinated by the folks in the Office of Environmental Education within the Department of Environmental Quality. In finding fascinating person to come and chat with us. Now, of course, the month of March is Women's History Month, and so we are celebrating by talking to amazing women who have achieved incredible things and are doing cool work out there. And for today, it's awesome because we also get to hear, I think, some stories of incredible women who have achieved great things and done awesome work. So let me bring in today's guest speaker because I know you're excited for it. I am too. Today's guest is Kathryn Aalto. Kathryn is a New York Times best-selling author, a historian, a designer, a teacher, a speaker, and has written the book Writing Wild, which I'm excited to learn more about. And as I understand, Kathryn, you're normally outside of London, England, but not today. Is that right?
That's right, Chris. I'm in lovely Mobile, Alabama. I'm in the South
Oh,
along with you. I feel like we're in the same neck of the woods today.
oh yeah, absolutely. Well, you're certainly closer than you would be if you were in Great Britain.
Yeah, and the weather's beautiful. A bit chilly today. It's going to warm up to, I think, about 70. So yeah, it's a beautiful day to say happy spring to you.
Yes, happy spring. I guess we're in the first official 24 hours of springtime now, aren't we?
We are. Yeah, yeah. So and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me, and thank you to all the people behind the scenes. So Chris, we're going to be together for about an hour. Is that right?
Yeah, we've got the hour set aside for your presentation, but then, of course, we're going to chat with our audience members as well.
Excellent. So I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes then, and I will set aside time for questions for about 15 minutes. So shall I get started, Chris?
I think so. I'm excited for it. Take it
Okay,
away.
excellent. Excellent. So here we go. Let's begin. So hello, everybody. It's lovely to be with you today. Happy spring. It's a beautiful down here in the South. And I hope I would love to have a Southern accent. So but forgive me if I bend into that a little bit. We'll see what happens. But happy also Women's History Month. And it's a delight and an honor to be here. And today I'm going to be speaking on my second book for Timber Press called Writing Wild: Women Poets, Ramblers, and Mavericks Who Shape How We See the Natural World. Um, and this is what it looks like. I love the cover. And this cover was designed in conversation with the book designer and the illustrator, because at the end of the book, I say, I wish I could put the 25 women I profile into a meadow where we could all talk and walk together. And in fact, after writing the book, it takes about a year to write a book. It felt like they were all friends, even though I spanned 200 years from Dorothy Wordsworth all the way to Elizabeth Rush. I felt like I had gotten to know them really well. So that's why you see them reading together and exploring in a meadow together. But as Chris said, I am not in my neck of the woods. I am in I am a dual citizen from the US and the UK. And I live in one of the most beautiful counties in England called Devon. So I grew up reading The Wind in the Willows. And I always wanted to live in a storybook landscape. And in fact, a lot of what I do in England is walk, because we have the right to roam. So I am a writer who writes a lot of essays. And the essence of the essay is a walk. And in fact, in a personal essay, your tone can be very personal. So I wanted to show this because this is, in fact, what it looks like where I live. And also in Writing Wild, I ended up walking the footpaths and the footfalls, following in the footsteps of women who came before me, whether it was Dorothy Wordsworth or Sachi Lloyd, or if they were no longer around, retracing where they lived and the landscapes that inspired them. So, and this is where I live now. So every day, this is where I walk. It's along a ship canal that's centuries old. So that tells you a little bit about where I've come from. As Chris mentioned, I am a garden historian, landscape designer. I write books for Timber Press. I'm particularly interested in people, plants, and places, and that's my niche. And I teach online courses, and I do a lot of public speaking, which is why I'm in Mobile, Alabama. And this is what it looks like in my neck of the woods. So, so I bring readers along to explore 25 classic, new, and female nature writers, the lives, literature, landscapes, and legacies of these really important women. And you can see another book that I've written, The Natural World of Winnie the Pooh, A Walk Through the Forest that inspired the 100-Acre Wood, has that sense of walking in it. So that is part of how I write. So I was a pretty good person to be paired with this topic, but there's the book there. So we're talking about nature writing. And like any other art, like sculpture or painting, music, dance, literature, nature writing is a cultural artifact. And but this is interesting, as it shows, nature writing shows how women's bodies have moved through time and space. So the nature writing that we do shows our access to the landscape, which is why I talked a little bit about the kind of walking I do now, which by the end of our time together, you'll realize is not the way that we have always moved through the landscape. So nature writing shows our movement in the landscape. It shows our access in two different kinds of landscapes, literal and figurative. And it also shows a lack of access. So if we can't move, if we can't write, if we can't use our own names, etc., then we are less likely to have our writing represented. So again, if there's literal and figurative lack of access to publishing, to university education, and so forth, it's no wonder that women were less represented. And the stories I'm going to tell you today will give you some senses of who actually still tried to do it. And so this limited access to publishing and perambulations, literature and landscapes, walking and writing is really what we're talking about today, and celebrating how much we've changed. But all of this is our history. And in Women's History Month, it's a really good time to reflect upon who we've been, where we are, and how we want to step into our future. So, and Women's Nature Writers shows us where we have been and where we are going. It shows how our culture is changing. And these are the women that I profiled. Everyone from Dorothy Wordsworth, Susan Fenimore Cooper, Jean Stratton Porter, Annie Dillard, Gretel Ehrlich, lots of names, Mary Austin, Vita Sackville West, Nan Shepherd, Rachel Carson, and all the way to Elizabeth Rush. It's funny now, who did I profile first? Who did I write about first? I wrote about the pillars of nature writing, the people who really fundamentally shaped us, our perceptions. So I started with Rachel Carson, and I started writing about her in my greenhouse in spring. It wasn't the first day of spring, it was in April a couple of years ago. If she were around, I would have written her an email and said, could we walk together? But it wasn't possible. So I had a really interesting creative moment when the women for the women who are no longer around, how to bring them to life on the page. And I think I did that. So are you ready to take a spring walk together? Let's do that right now. And this is what it looks like. Well, not quite yet, but the bluebells in a drover's path. This is not far from where I live. So next month, we'll have electrifying carpets of bluebells, and people will be walking all over, and I'll be back then to do that. So we're going to walk with a few of the 25 women I profile in Writing Wild. Dorothy Wordsworth, Susan Fenimore Cooper, Gene Stratton Porter, Mary Austin, and a couple of others that I toss in as well. And all the while, I shall be keeping my eye on the time. So now, just because I'm celebrating women doesn't mean I'm have to diss the men who have come before. In fact, my environmental mindset has been highly shaped by men. Dead, white, privileged men, as we say, able-bodied as well. So people like John James Audubon, who explored the South and captured magnolias and other beautiful American flora in paintings. His writing was important for me, as was especially the American transcendentalists like Ralph Waldo Emerson, and especially Walden by Henry David Thoreau. So in no way am I dismissing the work that has come before. As I write in the foreword to Writing Wild, I say I can no easier extract Henry David Thoreau from my mindset as I can, like the Bee Gees from my early teen years. I was a Bee Gees fan, or Andy Gibb. They are just impossible to separate. So I want to make that really clear, that I acknowledge the privilege that has come before, and I'm giving the reasons why women have been underrepresented. You know, you look at someone like Walt Whitman and Leaves of Grass, and John Burroughs and John Muir and Henry Beston. These are all notably bearded white guys, and they are all really important, but they are not the only voices. In fact, I love what Henry Beston wrote. We're just going to hear a little bit of Henry Beston's voice here. The world today is sick to its thin blood for lack of elemental things, for fire before the hands, for water welling from the earth, for air, for the dear earth itself underfoot. In my world of beach and dunes, these elemental presences lived and had their being, and under their arch there moved an incomparable pageant of nature and the year. I teach Henry Beston's The Outermost House a lot in my nature writing classes. So there we go. I have made my case, but let's turn to the women now that we've acknowledged the men. So let's take a walk. The first woman that I profiled in Writing Wild shows really a lot of the lack of privileges that women had. So Dorothy Wordsworth, this is about the only image that I could come across. There was another one, another painting that I came across in Windermere in England. But she was born in 1771 in a market town on the western edge of the Lake District. And I'd like to take you on a journey up Scawfell Pike. Scawfell Pike is England's tallest mountain, and to we Americans, it's a mere hill, but I'm going to take you up that Scawfell Pike right now. So this is me talking a little bit about Dorothy Wordsworth, and it's nice to be read stories, isn't it? So I'm going to read to you for about 4 or 5 minutes, or 4 minutes, and I'm going to take you up Scawfell Pike, and this is what it looks like. She climbed it in 1818. Our journey begins in Wasdale, one of the most remote valleys in England's Lake District. In the pink pre-dawn light of midsummer, I set out on a narrow lane lined in dry stone walls overflowing in fragrant wild honeysuckle, mustard, and lichen. I pass St. Olaf's, possibly England's smallest church, a stone structure set amid a grove of yews and ancient Viking fields. I lift the latch marked Scawfell Pike. I lift the latch at a path marked Scawfell Pike, step through the gate and hear the metallic clink break the morning silence. I cross a pasture toward a wooden bridge and onto a narrow ascending gravel trail. The way is up, but Scawfell Pike, the peak I'm aiming for and England's tallest, is hidden for the moment by Goat Crag. I walk through Bracken Close, then rise along the rocky cascades of Lingmel Gill and higher, through alpine meadows and carpets of moss along Brown Tongue. Above me is Black Crag, a peak shorter than my destination, and I stop here to appreciate the pleasures of total silence. When I begin hiking again, I can hear my breath and my feet crunching in the gravel. Somewhere in the clear air above me, a ring ouzel calls, pauses, then sings a warbled song at hand, a warbled song that sounds like marbles in hand. An hour passes, 1,500 feet climbed. Higher up at Lingmel Col, the saddle between Broadcrag and Scafell Pike, Herdwick sheep rest in boulder shadows, where they leave tufts of black and white wool in the parsley fern. The sun is rising and soon it will be hot. My legs are strong and I travel light. I don't mean to overtake two sets of highly kitted men, but I do, and I wink at them. I reach a large debris field of scree and shattered rock and look for cairns to lead me in the final steep climb. I leap across rocks and boulders. There are some final steps onto a platform, and I'm finally standing at the 3,209-foot summit. For a little while, before less early risers make their way up, I am alone on one of the world's most rapturous stages. I take a deep breath, surrounded by a study in blues. Dark blue lakes, indigo mountain shadows, robin egg sky. It's 7 in the morning, and the sun is spreading golden light into these blue hues. I see Helvellyn and Skiddaw and can just make out the Mourne Mountains across the Irish Sea and Snowdonia in Wales to the south. Somewhere in the hills below me is Grasmere, the home of England's most famous poet. Here on top of Scafell Pike, it's easy to understand why few landscapes are more steeped in literary history than this. It's a place celebrated over 200 years ago by the enraptured band of brothers known as the Lake Poets, Robert Southey, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and William Wordsworth, who all walked and wrote among these hills and vales. In their landmark 1798 lyrical ballads, Wordsworth and Coleridge sought to overturn the pompous epic poetry that came before them. They were their generation's Sex Pistols and Dead Kennedys, and this was poetry's punk moment. Old subjects were thrown out, sensations celebrated. In ordinary language and in folk ballad form, these poets celebrated their own memories, their own emotions, and their own experiences in nature. Their work represents the start of what is known as English Romanticism, the artistic celebration of the individual, nature, and the past that extended from the late 1700s to the early 1800s. It was a reaction to the Industrial Revolution and the new faith in reason, science, and mathematics embodied by the Enlightenment. Romantics sought a return to individual experiences like awe, horror, and fear as a way to cultivate mystery and wonder in an increasingly mechanistic society. In simple terms, you could say that a romantic preferred to wake up to a cockerel than a clock. Squinting in the direction of Grasmere, I think of Glencoyne Bay near Ullswater, where Wordsworth and his younger sister Dorothy often walked together. I haven't climbed all this way to celebrate him. 170 years after his death, he still has his fame, and rightly so. Instead, I'm here to celebrate Dorothy. So there's the ring ouzel. Okay, so Dorothy Wordsworth, as I mentioned, was born in 1771, and both their parents died when they were under 10 years old, and her 4 brothers stayed in the Lake District, and she was sent to an aunt and uncle across England in Yorkshire, and she didn't see, it's not separated by more than 100 miles, and yet they never saw each other in 10 years. So when they were reunited, 10 years later, they realized that they both shared what we know now as a kind of romantic kind of temperament. That is to say, this interest in cultivating raw expressions and putting it into writing, into poetry that sounded like a folk ballad, that celebrated awe and horror and fear and beauty. And Wordsworth, her brother, William Wordsworth, arguably author of the most famous poem in the English language, which is called Daffodils, which we should be reading in a moment, especially since it's spring here. But what happened is that Dorothy had the same kind of temperament as Wordsworth, a real romantic temperament. And many say that she wrote better than he did. But there are a couple of key differences between the two Wordsworths. The first is that her brother he went to Cambridge. Women couldn't go to universities. We were not formally educated. She also was not allowed to walk alone. Like a lot of women, we experience what's called reputational anxiety. And we were basically setting ourselves up to be more than catcalled when we walked alone. It was not what women did. And so we were not able to walk alone. We didn't have access to education. And even if we wanted something published, there was no way. It was really, really difficult to have anything published. However, there was an immortal walk that these two did, the brother and the sister did in 1802. And this is what Dorothy wrote about it. Now, she kept I'm going to read this first and tell you what she did with her writing. So she wrote, when they were walking along Glencoyne Bay and they came across a bank of beautiful daffodils. And this is what she wrote. Move this here. When we were in the woods beyond Galborough Park, we saw a few daffodils close to the waterside. We fancied that the lake had floated the sea to shore and that the little colony had sprung up. But as we went along, there were more and yet more. And at last, under the boughs of the trees, we saw that there was a long belt of them all along the shore, about the breadth of a country turnpike road, not toad. I never saw daffodils so beautiful. They grew among the mossy stones about and about them. Some rested their heads upon these stones as on a pillow for weariness, and the rest tossed and reeled and danced and seemed as if they were verily as they verily laughed, and with the wind that blew upon them over the lake. They looked so gay, ever changing, ever glancing, ever changing. So this is what she wrote. Now, what she did is she kept an open journal that she left open at a place where she lived with her brother called Dove Cottage, and several of the lake poets would just look in her own notebook and would pull out things that she wrote that they wanted to use themselves. Now, what would we call that today? We would call that plagiarism, wouldn't we? But that, I don't know if she would mind, but we can mind for her. This is what William Wordsworth wrote in his very famous poem, Daffodils. He wrote, "I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze." So, borrowing his sister's ideas, he put them into arguably this most famous of English poems. So I'll let you all ascertain. You can read a little bit more in my own book, or you can do your own research. What do you think that's wrong? Do you think that she should have been given credit? He also wrote. William Wordsworth also wrote a book about walking in the Lake District, and he took a full-on essay that she had written about a walk and called it his own. And didn't give her credit. Now, I don't know his mindset, but we can mind for her now as we look back. So here we have the sister, Dorothy Wordsworth, the sister of England's most famous poet. He was poet laureate at the time, lifting things his own sister wrote and not giving her credit. So that's one of the biggest lessons that we can get. And in fact, many scholars think that she is a finer poet than he is. And in my book, Writing Wild, I have many samples of her own writing that you can read as well. But this is the cottage here, Dove Cottage, where they lived. It's a lovely place, and the garden has actually been remade, restored to look like what it would have looked like with Dorothy Wordsworth planting it, filled with wild strawberries and foxgloves and dandelions and other beautiful flowers. So I would say that, as I wrote at the end, there's a picture of her, a painting of her at what is it? Rydal Mount, which is a place that she also lived with her brother and his family in Gradsmere. I come across a painting of her, and I write, her gray blue eyes are lively. Like many women who spent decades walking, Dorothy lived long, to age 83. And though she was not without health problems, her eyes retained their twinkle. On her lap is a paper notebook, to her side a collection of inkwells, and perhaps a canister of opium. She looks vibrant and alive. This woman treaded and recorded our literary landscapes before they were iconic. and she helped make them so. Far more than the poet's sister, she is a woman worth her own words. Dorothy Wordsworth, mountaineer, diarist, and poet. Across the pond was the daughter of James Fenimore Cooper. Her name was Susan Fenimore Cooper. And believe it or not, she was America's first nature writer. She wrote in a place called Cooperstown, and she wrote a book called Rural Hours. Now take a good look at that cover. I am a dogged primary source researcher, so I always like to go to landscapes where people moved, and I like to handle first editions. I try to get as close as possible to the originals. Notice that it's written by a lady. So in addition to lack of access to education and not being able to walk alone, we couldn't even use our names. And everybody knows that by anonymous and by a lady was always a woman, of course, by a lady. So why is that so? So Rural Hours was published in 1850, 4 years before Henry David Thoreau's Walden. And what she does is she captures this landscape, this changing landscape over, it looks like a calendar year, which is a very typical kind of structure for nature writing, following a calendar year of living deeply in a place and observing that place. So I was fortunate to be able to go for a walk and some hiking and so forth. And canoeing and whatnot. So what I would like to say about her is that, well, let me go to somebody famous wrote this. So her books, even though many people knew that it was Susan Fenimore Cooper, she didn't actually put her name onto books until like the 6th edition or so. So they sold well-ish. But someone wrote this here. I'll let you guess who it is. Talking of books, I am in the middle of one which pleases me, viz. Miss Cooper's Journal of a Naturalist. Who is she? She seems a very clever woman and gives a capital account of the battle between our and your weeds. Does it not hurt your Yankee pride that we thrash you so confoundedly? So someone who had read that, quite famous, in a letter to his friend Asa Gray in 1862, Charles Darwin wrote this about Susan Fenimore Cooper. Now, why is her work so important? One of the reasons is that she created, well, arguably America's first land epic, and she wrote in a diary entry from July 28th. Independently of their market price in dollars and cents, the trees have other values. They're connected in ways with the civilization of a country. They have their importance in an intellectual and in a moral sense. After the first rude stages of progress is passed in a new country, when shelter and food have been provided, people begin to collect the conveniences and pleasures of a permanent home about their dwellings. And then the farmer generally sets out a few trees before his door. This is very desirable, but it is only the first step in the track. Go back here so you can see this here. The preservation of fine trees already standing marks a further progress, and this point we have not yet reached. It frequently happens that the same man who yesterday planted some half dozen branchless saplings before his door will today cut down a noble elm or oak only a few rods from his house, an object which was in itself 100-fold more beautiful than any other in his possession. In very truth, a fine tree near a house is a much greater embellishment than the thickest coat of paint that could be put on its walls, or a whole row of wooden columns to adorn its front. Nay, a large shady tree in a dooryard is much more desirable than the most expensive mahogany and velvet sofa in the parlor. So that is someone who is remarking on the quote progress that's being made. Old growth forests were being cut down, and it was no longer a frontier at that point. And she is watching the landscape change, and she is wondering in rural hours about how people value the landscape. So 4 years before Thoreau's famous Walden, Susan Fenimore Cooper wrote Rural Hours. Now, why do we not hear a lot about this? Well, why was it not popular? Why did Walden eclipse her, this book? And I would say, so one thing that I wrote about in my essay about her is this. In our current age of the selfie, it may be hard to imagine a time when speaking declaratively of oneself could be considered immodest and vain. But so women, and a lot of men too, did not use the word, the first person pronoun I in their writing. Nowadays we do. In fact, I use it all the time, judiciously. But 200 years ago, it was considered having the, quote, stench of ego, as Philip Lopate wrote in The Art of the Personal Essay. So some writers at that time used it. And I would argue that this is one of the reasons why Rural Hours is not well known. Henry David Thoreau's book, Thoreau jumps off the page. In fact, on one page, I counted, he used the word I 17 times. She uses it not once. And it really adds a kind of zestiness when you have a sense of the writer on the page. As I say here in Writing Wild, me, myself, and I make the small loom large in the personal universal. And most writers today employ it to different degrees in a conversational style. So the other reason she used this book is not so popular is because women were often accused of being dame scribblers. If we deigned to actually want to write a book, we were actually put down. We were called female quill drivers, or a half man, or as I said, a scribbling dame. And that's why the modest moniker by a lady was something women often hid under. So, and Susan was never walking alone. She was always with a friend. So even though it took place over 2 years, she condenses it down to 1 year. And you never know who's with her. It's all very abstract, and some things are really not concrete. You get a sense of when robins come and go, and you get a really keen portrait of this region in the United States. But she's not on the page. She doesn't have that privilege of being on the page. And so I think that's one of the big lessons of Rural Hours. It's definitely worth reading. So here I'm obviously in Cooperstown, canoeing, walking, and trying to get to the source. Now, another woman, the third woman I write about is Jean Stratton Porter. And she is, let me keep my eye on the time here. Good. She was born in, let's see, she is, forget what year, 1883, I believe, 1880. She was born in Indiana, and she is one of the most interesting women I wrote about, because she was doing a lot of gender bending at the turn of the previous century. She was one of the first women who photographed birds without shooting them, stuffing them, and posing them. So before her, that is what men did. So as I wrote here, more than a century ago, there was another kind of J.K. Rowling, one whose best-selling books were set not in a school of witchcraft and wizardry, but in an Indiana swamp. The Limberlost, a 13,000-acre hardwood forest and wetland, with streams that flowed into eastern Indiana's Wabash River, was the setting for these romance novels, nature books, and films. The author, Geneva Stratton Porter, is a fascinating figure at the nexus of early 20th century changes in conservation and gender roles. Wife and mother, yes. Maverick, too. A gun-toting, bird-loving, moth-chasing, free-spirited filmmaker and artist who opened new territory for women and influenced American environmental ethics. Some have said her impact on conservation was as influential as President Theodore Roosevelt. So she wrote 28 books. It was a mixture of poetry and sort of honestly really sappy romantic novels that took place in the Limberlost. And then her favorite writing was writing about birds and moths and butterflies. So you can see I know it's not a compelling title, but the book there in the middle, Moths of the Limberlost, is probably one of my favorite books that she wrote. And it's because she was in the narrative. She is, in fact, I should write an essay just on how she was a fountainhead of what I write, which is creative or narrative nonfiction. She is in the narrative. She's not only taking us to a landscape that is no longer there, but she and the flora and fauna that inhabited this place. But she's giving a portrait of the history of the Midwest. So the Limberlost is about 13,000 acres, as I mentioned, in eastern central Indiana, tall grass prairies and so forth. And she captured the landscape before it was drained. So in 1850, there was a thing called the Swamp Act. And anybody who took swampy land and drained it and then made it arable could claim that land as their own, because the government deemed it worthless. So I wrote a lead story for Smithsonian Magazine that profiled Gene Stratton Porter, which is a lot of fun to write. So she had a really, so I've done more than what I wrote in Writing Wild about her. I've done quite a deep dive. And I think a book needs to be written about her. So she was remarkable. She wrote these incredibly sappy books about a strong female protagonist who would go out in her teenage years, would go out and collect moths and sell them, actually. And those books sold millions and millions and millions of copies. She was as famous as J.K. Rowling is now, I would say. And she also had a pretty profound environmental impact, because her books educated people on moths and inspired young women to go out and be a little bit more independent, because there was a dearth of strong female characters. So I would, if anybody is interested, in fact, I bet some people who are listening might have had Gene Stratton Porter books handed down to them. And go up to your attics or down to your basements and look around in books you might have inherited. And if you have a Gene Stratton Porter book, read them and really enjoy them. So she was the first woman to, as I mentioned, to capture birds live. She was she was very well paid for her photographs, but a lot of her books were made into films, because she was the first woman in Hollywood to own a film production studio. So all of those books that I've said were sappy but influential, many of them were made into films. But these are wonderful photographs here. And she says, an editor once said, well, what you're doing is not woman's work. You should not be going out alone and photographing these birds. And she wrote that, in fact, the reason I can capture them is I have the patience of a mother, because I can sit and listen and watch them. So imagine, today we go out and we photograph birds and so forth. We just whip out our smartphones out of our back pockets, don't we? So imagine going out into a snake-filled swamp with your horse and buggy and backing up with 100 pounds of rigging and rope and waiting. That's why she had to have guns, and she wore trousers and boots and so forth. So she had an incredibly rich life. I would say a film needs to be made out of her life. So clearly someone needs to write a book about her. So I've had the privilege of spending a fair amount of time in the Limberlost, but there she is there. I love the little frogs there on her lapel. So she was important more than about a century ago, actually. She also advocated against, in her writing, she advocated against songbirds being shot and killed to be put into women's hat fashion. So, whole birds and ridiculous ornaments would be made out of feathers and bodies of stuffed birds. And so her writing helped put a severe decline on that fashion. So here I am out in the tall grass prairie. So the Limberlost has been restored now. Parts of it have been restored based on her writing. So it's a case of life imitating art, imitating life. So these are, that is Kurt Burdett there, one of the rangers of the Limberlost. And he's taking people through an area of the Limberlost that's been restored based on Gene Stratton Porter's writing. Right, we are chugging right along, another couple minutes here. Mary Austin is also a really fascinating person. She wrote many books. She was a novelist, a playwright, a poet, and one of her most famous books that I often teach in my nature writing classes is called The Land of Little Rain. Published in 1903, it captured, like Gene Stratton Porter's books, a landscape that was changing. So one of my favorite films of all time is Chinatown, and it's a portrait of the water wars of Southern California. And The Land of Little Rain captures the Owens River Valley before the river was, the water was diverted for Los Angeles. And it captures indigenous people and it captures the flora and fauna in incredible ways. She was married and had she and her husband had a daughter with Down syndrome. And she was always getting her husband out of debt on a teacher's salary too. She lived a very, very, very hard life. And I write about how she moved from the Midwest to California. And before she ended up in the Owens River Valley where her brother lived, she went through San Francisco and she said, if this homesteading thing doesn't work out, and it's very difficult in the high desert, I'm returning to California, to San Francisco. And in fact, she did. There's Jack London there. And so Mary Austin became one of the most diverse writers of the time. Really, really interesting. And and she was important because she gave really vivid portraits of indigenous people of the Owens River Valley in Southern California in ways that really helped educate urbanites. So I highly recommend people read The Land of Little Rain. We're close to finishing up here. I'm gonna go quickly. Nan Shepherd also wrote in the Cairngorms. The Cairngorms are mountains in southeast Scotland. And she wrote this wonderful book that is a very instructional book for all women and men listening right now. So she was a famous, well-known, a Scottish modern novelist. But she also loved walking in the mountains, and she wrote The Living Mountain between the two wars. It was a really difficult time, of course, because so many men, a whole generation, were practically wiped out. And The Living Mountain is a very different book. It describes being in the landscape in ways that men in ways that male mountaineers didn't write. So that might now say, let me go to my own writing and read to you. Sorry, I'm going to, my mind is distracted because I'm trying to find the quote. So The Living Mountain is really interesting because it's only 30,000 words, but she was afraid of what the male dominated sort of mountaineering society in the Cairngorms would think of this book, because it's a very sensual book. It's not about climbing a mountain and conquering it. It's actually a real quiet book about occupying the recesses of a mountain. So I wrote, The Living Mountain is a departure from mountaineering literature by men. It's the first book of its kind in nature writing to be so intuitive and sensual, with a Buddhist approach to pilgrimage. Walking barefoot along a path of pine needles, sleeping in heather in the sunshine, undressing for a wild swim. Whether we are spiritual or sensual, salvationist or scientific, there should be no limitations imposed by others on the ways we find meaning in the natural world. Shepherd went to the mountains, not to measure and to quantify. Rather, she went to look, to think, to feel. In doing so, she captured the cairngorms in many dimensions and frequencies. So what she did is she wrote The Living Mountain, and fearful of what people would think, she put it in a drawer. How long do you think that manuscript sat in a drawer out of fear? A year? Two? No, almost 40 years. 40 years. And so the lesson there is, and in fact, when it was published in 1976, one of her young, someone who knew her, Adam Watson, who was a pretty well-known, esteemed, actually, glaciologist in the Cairngorms, said, this is a kind of book that that is very, it wasn't, it was too, she was anthropomorphizing the mountains, he felt. And I don't feel she was. This is her own sensual experience. So I think it's really interesting that, and this is the Cairngorms here, and here as well, that to be honest, I did skewer that critic of her. He was alive when I wrote the book, and then he died before it was published. And I don't think he would have minded that I called him out, because I think he was a straight shooter. But I like that despite those criticisms, she is actually on the Scottish 5-pound note. And I love, it says, it's a grand thing to get leave to live. So you can have your last laugh by becoming by being on some currency that people use every day. So Writing Wild celebrates the lives, living legacies, landscapes, and literature of 25 classic new and female nature writers. It's basically a girlfriend's guide in a way. Men can read it, of course, too, to the kind of writing that I did not read when I was an undergrad at Berkeley. So despite being influenced by Emerson and Thoreau and Whitman and Hawthorne and so forth, I missed Native American voices. I missed voices from people of color. So I was fortunate to go for a walk with Robin Wall Kimmerer and at the Environmental Literature Institute. Braiding Sweetgrass is a celebration of two very different ways of looking at the world. She is both a botanist, she's a scientist, and she's an Indigenous woman. And Braiding Sweetgrass shows how we can meld those two perspectives together using Indigenous wisdom. I also was really happy to read the book Black Faces, White Spaces by Carolyn Finney. So I highly recommend people read that book. She is now on the National Park Advisory Board, but she is a part Black. And she wrote, "What would it be like if John Muir walked into a meeting of the National Park Service Advisory Board and saw me there as a member?" Because he did make some racist comments. So this is the book here, Reimagining the Relationship of African Americans to the Great Outdoors. You might ask, was I changed in writing Wild? And indeed I was. It was fundamental to so many new perspectives, and doors were opened. And I love it when writing does that. And so thank you to all of these writers, including Trace by Laurette Savoy. Trace, Memory, History, Race, and the American Landscape. Laurette is a professor at Mount Holyoke in geology, so she has a real sense of deep time. And she is a part Native American, part Anglo-European, and part African-American. And the sense of trace, these different traces moving through her, is something that we very much need to read in nature writing. And then I end the book with Rising by Dispatches from the New American Shore by Elizabeth Rush, who has a new book out this year about motherhood and raising a child in the Anthropocene. And she writes, "I suspect fewer people will resist the term climate change, not just when floodwaters arrive at their doorsteps, but also when they get to tell their stories and sense that they have been heard." I'm going to end our time together with a little bit of Mary Oliver, if that's okay. And Mary Oliver was alive when I was writing this book, and then she died. And it was the one chapter that I felt I didn't get right on the first 15 drafts. And then my editor sensed it too. So I took myself to a hotel up in Bath, or as they say, Bath, England, and I rewrote it in 3 days because she was America's most favorite poet. And there were some things about her past that I didn't feel comfortable telling. So she was sexually abused by her own father. And how did she escape the feelings of insecurity and danger and abuse at home? She packed her backpack and went to the woods where she felt a lot more comfortable. So think of that. Think of a child having to escape her own house to feel safe outside. But that is the origin story of Mary Oliver. And so what I'm going to read to you is the last, we were fortunate to have 3 poems. We were able to use 3 of the poems, 3 of her poems in my essay on my profile of her. So I'm going to end with this poem and then take your questions. I'm going to end right here. The summer day. Who made the world? Who made the swan and the black bear? Who made the grasshopper? This grasshopper, I mean, the one who has flung herself out of the grass, the one who is eating sugar out of my hand, who is moving her jaws back and forth instead of up and down, who is gazing around with her enormous and complicated eyes. Now she lifts her pale forearms and thoroughly washes her face. Now she snaps her wings open and floats away. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel down in the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I have been doing all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? So on that note, I'd like to end our time together, and I'm really happy to have been able to talk to you in just an hour. If you get the book Writing Wild, you will spend a lot more time together in a way. But this idea of giving you a historical overview of why women haven't had access to the natural world, and to help you appreciate the ability of being able to go out and walk on your own, which is what I'm going to do after my talk. I'm going to walk around some botanic gardens here in Mobile. So lack of access to walking, lack of access to higher education, lack of access to publishing, the inability to use our own names, to use something simple like I, and reputational anxiety and this sense of impropriety, and not being taken seriously and called names. We are able to do that now. And you when you read Writing Wild, you'll get a sense of me moving alone in the landscape. So I am a portrait of a modern woman. And in light of the first many essays of the book, you can see that how times have changed. So thank you so much for inviting me here today. You're welcome to connect with me at Kathryn Aalto if you'd like, but I'd love to take your questions now. Thank you so much. Chris.
Kathryn, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing. That was fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely incredible stuff. And yes, viewers, go ahead and drop your thoughts and questions into the chat. I'm going to turn to you in just a moment for your questions because we have several minutes left to be able to have conversation. So I'm excited for that. But, you know, Kathryn, I want to go back to something you were talking about right at the very beginning, which is the idea that you wish that you could get all 25 of these people together in a meadow or in the forest in order to sit and enjoy one another's company. But I'll put it to you, if one of them were going to reach out and say, let's go for a walk, who are you hoping you get that letter from?
Yeah, you know, I've been asked that before and I've dodged it.
Oh, well, you could dodge it here too and
No,
just
no,
say,
no, 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 no. I almost want a composite of everybody. I would say probably Mary Austin, because she had such a hard life and she wrote diamond sharp prose that feels like desert wind has kind of blown through them. It's really elegant, precise prose, and she did it all with a very, very tough life. And I suppose also she lived at a time when women's roles were changing. You know, she was a suffragette. We couldn't vote yet, and she also wrote she wrote poetry and novels, and she just did it. She had a profound sense of confidence and you know, she divorced her husband, which not a lot of women did, so that she could devote her time to writing. And she had a really important impact on American literature at the time, and educating too people about indigenous people.
Yeah, wow. Do you think the conversation would be about yeah, I don't know, the Blowing Desert Sands or the indigenous communities, or do you think you'd want to like get into the mechanics of writing and the experience?
I think yeah, I'd like to go on a walk with her and just hear her educate me. I'd just be quiet. I would just sit back and let her take me on a tour of the. I'd like to have her see the Owens River Valley now, and have her. Really love her perspective on a changed landscape. So any woman who knew a landscape before we fundamentally changed it would be really, really interesting. And I spent a lot of, I just, you know, time totally compressed when I was writing the book. So it was really, I was able to, and that's what happens. You don't snorkel on the surface of an idea. You're deeply scuba diving into it, and your mind goes all, you know, to different places. And so these women were really alive in my mind, and it's a real honor to get to that point where your manuscript is talking and they're knocking on the window of your computer, like saying, "Represent me this way." And so I really wish that I could have their views on how we live today. And also, one person I did profile was one of my former professors at Berkeley, called Carolyn Merchant, and she wrote a book called The Death of Nature, which is regarded as one of the top 5 environmental history books written. And that book is really, she's alive. I've chatted with her, but I think we don't understand how our relationship with the natural world has so fundamental. We are in a new. It seems like this is all very normal to us, the way we live now. But she writes about how our relationship with nature was very different before the scientific revolution in the beginning of about the 15th century, when we put nature on trial and we began harnessing nature in ways that we had never done before. And I think I would almost want to, and she talked about as well that we had a really different relationship with the cosmos, that we understood our place in the world in a very different way. And I would say, of anybody, you know, I write about in the book 25 women. It's like 25 different trees in a forest. And Carolyn Merchant writes about how the forest came to be, you know, and it's ecofeminism, which is a word that I think everyone should know about and to understand deeply. So yeah, I would say to people, read The Death of Nature too, if you want a very big perspective on how we're living today and how we've come to live the way we do today.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. David wants to know, where have you taken some of your favorite walks lately?
Oh, thank you, David, for that question. Well, I am working, well, I'm walking all the time, but I just finished the 120-mile Two Moors Way in Devon. That's going from the south to the north. So I did that in about 10 days in August. Um, I'm also walking the Thames River path from the source to the sea. That's sort of broken up. My family and I walk the coast to coast path, which is about 200 miles across from west to east. And I'm also working on the Southwest Coast Path, which is about 670 to 620 miles or so around the Southwest Peninsula. And I'm about 200 miles into it. So I have a long way to go. Yeah. Thank you,
Oh,
David, for
wow.
that question.
That's great. And David had a follow-up too, related. Are you most drawn to landscapes, plants, animals, etc.? Or
Um,
focus?
well, nothing can really kill you in England. So we have a very safe landscape. I suppose I'm drawn to I think I think I really like to walk on narrow paths that are ancient, you know, that are hundreds and hundreds of years old. About 30 minutes from my house, where I live in England, is a 4,000-year-old stone circle, and you know, there's nothing like that to give you a wallop of history. So yeah, I like to walk in landscapes that remind me that we're all just passing through, and that we should be very good stewards of this place.
Oh, that sounds beautiful.
It is beautiful.
It's
Yeah.
great. I, it's fascinating to hear some of the stories that you shared. And it's great the way that you weave in the historical perspectives with the individual interests and skills of these women involved. Like that Dorothy Wordsworth is such an incredible writer, but that could not have had access or was not given access for her writing to be known, and especially the idea that people just like peel through her writings and lift ideas and lift things like that. Like you put the question to us, and I was like, no, of course that's not okay. That's totally wrong, and we would, you know, we might cancel those people for jumping out there and doing that sort of plagiarism, or in the academic circles that some of these people traveled in, it especially would have been, in a more modern era, would have been totally career-ending kinds of stuff that it could happen back then. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah, academics know about Dorothy Wordsworth, but I write for Timber Press, which is for a general readership. And so my task as a writer was to take, academic writing and make it accessible so that people could really understand that we live in we have fundamentally changed the world. I mean, we do not live in, Dorothy Wordsworth saw, yes, it was the Industrial Revolution was happening at the time. And the Romantics were trying to preserve this part of us that was pre-industrial, that was affected by that. And so her writing is that cultural artifact of the human spirit before, not like there's one human spirit, a human spirit before it was, changed. And people think now it's so healthy to go for a walk, and it's so healthy to garden, and it's so healthy to not feel like you're a cog in the machine. Well, these romantics really capture that in their writing, and they weren't just writing. They were putting their fist up at what was happening to humans at the time, and so their writing is her writing and his writing. We're celebrating women, though. Really celebrates that and reminds us what what feels good is often that is a right way to live, moving and being in the landscape and feeling things, and just using the writing to help keep check on where we've been and where we're going.
Absolutely. Well, it looks like we are at time. Kathryn, thank you for being with us today and sharing.
Thank you, Chris, and to everyone behind the scenes. It's been an honor to be here virtually in North Carolina. Thank you so much.
I hope you enjoy your walk in Mobile today.
I will. I'm going to see lots of wisteria. Yes, that's what's blooming. Thank
Yes.
you, Chris.
Well, enjoy. It sounds great. Viewers, thanks for being with us today. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be back here again next Wednesday at noon with another fascinating program for you. I guarantee it. Don't miss out. You can head to naturalsciences.org, the museum's website, where you can look at the calendar of events and figure out what's coming up next. You can also head to the Office of Environmental Education's website, eenorthcarolina.org. In your inbox on Wednesday. That way you're just a click away and can come join us. So I hope you'll join us again soon. Come and learn from fascinating people. Next week, we're talking to Dr. Terry Long from North Carolina State University's Plant Sciences Initiative. It's going to be fascinating. I've looked into some of Dr. Long's work in the past. It's really cool stuff, so don't miss out. Take care, everybody. Be safe, be well, maybe go for a walk. We'll see you again next week. Bye, everybody.